Britain is a maritime nation in a way that is easy to say and difficult to fully comprehend. The island of Great Britain has more than 11,000 miles of coastline. It has natural harbors at intervals along almost its entire perimeter. And for most of the past 500 years, those harbors were the primary interface between Britain and the world, the places where goods arrived from every continent, where people departed for every corner of the empire, where the raw materials of global trade were received and the manufactured products of British industry were dispatched. The harbour was not just a physical place, it was the hinge of the British economy, and the Harbour Railway was the mechanism that made that hinge work.
There is a kind of railway that most people walk past without recognizing it as a railway at all. It runs along the edge of a harbour wall, or behind a row of warehouses, or across the open surface of a working dock. Its tracks are embedded in the cobblestones or the concrete, flush with the surface so that lorries and forklifts can cross them without difficulty. Its locomotives, when they exist at all, are small and industrial and entirely unromantic. No gleaming express engines here, no elegant carriages. This is the port railway, the Harbour Line, the railway that built the British Empire not by moving passengers in comfort, but by moving freight in volume, connecting the hold of the ship to the warehouse to the main line, closing the last gap in the chain that linked the production of the world to the consumption of Britain, and the consumption of Britain to the production of the world. Most of it is gone now, but the traces remain if you know how to look.
The first purpose-built port railway in Britain, or at least the first one that left a clear documentary record, was the Surrey Iron Railway, opened in 1803, which ran from the Thames at Wandsworth to Croydon, and was designed to carry goods between the river and the interior. But the Surrey Iron Railway was a gentle prologue. The real story of British port railways begins with the expansion of the commercial docks in the 1820s and 1830s. The West India docks, the East India docks, the London docks, and the question that every dock operator faced: how do you move the goods that arrive by ship to the warehouses, and from the warehouses to the rest of the country, without the bottleneck of horse-drawn wagons choking the dock roads? The answer, which took some time to arrive but was eventually obvious, was the same answer that was transforming every other freight problem in Britain at exactly this moment. You build a railway. The Port of London was the largest port in the world for much of the 19th century, and its railway network was correspondingly extraordinary. At the peak of its operation, the dock railway network within the Port of London Authority system comprised hundreds of miles of track winding through the enclosed docks: the West India docks, the Millwall docks, the Royal Victoria, the Royal Albert, the King George V docks, connecting quaysides to transit sheds to warehouses to the mainline connections at the edges of the dock estate. The locomotives that operated this system were small industrial tanks, painted in the colors of the Port of London Authority, driven by men who spent their entire working lives within the dock walls and knew every siding and every crossing and every quirk of a track system that had been laid, altered, extended, and modified over a century of operational need. It was a world within a world, and most Londoners never saw it.
Southampton was different from London, where London's docks were enclosed, great rectangular basins of water cut into the land surrounded by high walls and accessible only through dock gates. Southampton's ocean dock was open, a terminal where the great ocean liners of the 20th century berthed directly alongside. The boat train is one of the most specifically British railway experiences, and Southampton is where it reached its most elaborate expression. When the great Cunard and White Star liners arrived at Southampton, the Mauretania, the Olympic, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, boat trains from London Waterloo ran directly onto the dock estate, pulling alongside the ship so that first-class passengers could step from their cabin gangway into a Pullman carriage without experiencing the outside air any longer than necessary. The railway track ran to the ship's side. The locomotive that had pulled the train from London sat at the dock edge. The ship and the train formed a single integrated transport system, and the Harbour Railway was the joint that connected them.
The Titanic departed from Southampton on the 10th of April 1912. The boat trains that brought its passengers from London to the dockside ran on the dock railway that connected Waterloo to the White Star berth at the ocean dock. The passengers who walked from those carriages up the gangway of the ship, the 710 who would survive and the 1,500 who would not, crossed Harbour Railway track on their way aboard. The Titanic story is told endlessly in terms of the ship, the iceberg, the lifeboats. It is almost never told in terms of the railway that delivered its passengers to the sea. But the Harbour Railway was there at the beginning of that story, as it was at the beginning and end of almost every great maritime story of the 20th century.
The fishing ports of Britain had their own version of the Harbour Railway, and it was in some ways the most urgent and most dramatic. The fish trade operates on a timeline that tolerates no delay. A catch of herring that has been out of the water for 18 hours is approaching the edge of commercial viability, and every additional hour degrades the product and reduces the price. The Great Eastern Railway understood this and built what became one of the most remarkable freight operations in British railway history, the fish trains of Yarmouth and Lowestoft, which collected the catch from the quayside immediately after the boats docked and ran it to London's Billingsgate market at speeds and frequencies that kept the fish marketable. The harbour sidings at Yarmouth and Lowestoft were alive through the night, fish being unloaded from the boats, packed into ice, loaded into refrigerated vans, and moved into the waiting trains within hours of being caught. The railway track ran to the water's edge. The fish market in London opened each morning because of what had happened on a harbour line in Norfolk the night before.
Dover is the closest point in Britain to the European continent, and its harbour railway has a history that is both intensely practical and occasionally genuinely dramatic. The train ferry, the service that loaded entire railway carriages onto ships for transport across the Channel and delivery directly onto French railway tracks, operated from Dover Harbour from 1936 until 1995. The logistics of the train ferry required harbour track that was precisely aligned with the ship's deck tracks, which were themselves precisely aligned with the French standard gauge track on the other side of the Channel. A British Railway sleeping car could, in theory and in practice for the night ferry service that ran from 1936 to 1980, be boarded at Victoria Station in London and arrive at Paris Gare du Nord the following morning without the passenger leaving their compartment, having been loaded onto a ship at Dover Marine Station and unloaded at Dunkirk, the entire operation accomplished while the passengers slept. The Harbour Railway at Dover was the mechanism that made this possible, and the night ferry was one of the most civilized ways to travel between two countries that has ever been devised.
Hull. Kingston upon Hull is a port city that most of southern England rarely thinks about and that deserves far more attention than it receives. The Hull docks, at their peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were handling a volume of trade, primarily with Scandinavia, Germany, and the Baltic, that made Hull one of the most important commercial ports in Britain. The Northeastern Railway and its successors operated an extensive dock railway system in Hull that connected the Albert, William Wright, Alexandra, and King George docks to the main network. The Hull fish trade, like the East Anglian fish trade, depended on a rapid connection between the quayside and the National Railway network. And the Hull docks had a particular feature that distinguished them: the timber trade. The vast quantities of timber arriving from Scandinavia and Russia, essential for Victorian Britain's construction industry, required dock sidings of considerable length because timber loads are long and heavy and need a great deal of linear track to handle efficiently. The timber sidings of Hull docks were a landscape in themselves, forests of imported wood stacked alongside the rails and the particular smell of fresh-cut pine and salt water that anyone who worked there in those years never forgot.
There is a harbour railway in Britain that is still operating as a passenger service, and it is one of the most unlikely and charming railway experiences the country offers. The Festiniog Railway in Wales, originally a narrow-gauge industrial railway built to carry slate from the quarries of Blaenau Festiniog to the harbour at Porthmadog, now operates as a heritage railway carrying passengers between the mountains and the sea. At Porthmadog Harbour Station, the train arrives at the edge of the harbour, and the relationship between the railway and the maritime world that was the original reason for the railway's existence is still physically present. The track ends at the quayside, the harbour is beside you, and the connection between what the railway carried and where it was going is legible in the landscape in a way that most heritage railways, which operate in a landscape from which their industrial reason for being has been completely removed, cannot offer. The Festiniog Railway is a working memory of what a harbour railway was built to be.
There are people in Britain who can still read a harbour. Not just see it, read it. They walk along a waterfront and see, in the pattern of the cobblestones or the concrete, the ghost of a railway that was lifted decades ago. A slight depression in the road surface where the rails were cut out and the infill has settled differently from the surrounding material. A gatepost with the hinge still present, but the gate long gone, positioned at exactly the angle that would have guarded a dock railway crossing. A section of wall with a lintel at the wrong height for a road vehicle, but exactly the right height for a railway wagon. The Harbour Railway has left its traces everywhere in the physical fabric of Britain's port towns, and they are legible to anyone who learns the grammar of industrial archaeology. This knowledge is becoming rare. The people who learned it from direct experience are aging, and the traces themselves, slowly, are being smoothed away by resurfacing and development and the general indifference of a country that has largely forgotten how its harbours once worked.
The decline of the British port railway was a process that took most of the second half of the 20th century and was driven by forces that had nothing to do with the railways themselves. Containerization, the standardization of cargo into steel boxes of uniform size that could be moved by crane between ship, lorry, and railway flat car, transformed port logistics so completely that the elaborate dock railway systems of the Victorian and Edwardian era became not just obsolete, but actively obstructive. The old enclosed docks with their warehouses built to the quayside and the railways running between buildings and narrow alleys were simply the wrong
shape for containerization. The container revolution needed open land, large cranes, and lorry access, not intricate railway track layouts designed for a different kind of cargo movement. The great enclosed docks of London were closed between 1967 and 1981. The railway systems were lifted. The land was redeveloped, most famously as Canary Wharf, the financial district that now occupies the site of the West India and Millwall docks. The financial capital of the 21st century is built on the physical footprint of the industrial port railway of the 19th.
The Docklands Light Railway, the automated metro that serves the former East London docks, including the site of the old Port of London Authority railway network, is in one sense a descendant of the harbour railways it replaced. It uses elevated viaducts that follow in places the alignments of old dock railway routes. It serves communities that grew up around the docks. Its stations carry names: West India Quay, Poplar, Blackwall, that are the names of the dock infrastructure the railway served. But the connection is ghostly rather than direct. The DLR carries office workers and tourists through a landscape of glass towers and converted warehouses. It does not smell of rope and fish and coal smoke and the particular sweetness of sugar being unloaded from a West Indian cargo ship. The harbour railway it descended from smelled of all of those things, and the smell was the most truthful record of what was actually happening at the hinge between Britain and the world. There is something that the Harbour Railway understood about the relationship between land and sea that its replacement, the lorry, the container, the modern port terminal, does not fully grasp. The Harbour Railway was a threshold technology. It existed at the exact boundary between two modes of movement, the ship and the train, and its entire purpose was to manage the transition between them as smoothly as possible. A cargo that crossed that threshold without interruption, moving from the ship's hold to the railway wagon to the warehouse without ever being set down in the open, was a cargo protected from weather and pilferage and delay. The Harbour Railway was about continuity, keeping things moving, keeping the chain intact, refusing to allow the gap between ship and land transport to become a place where value was lost or time was wasted. This is still, in principle, what a good logistics system does. But the Harbour Railway did it with a directness and a physical legibility that modern logistics, for all its efficiency, has replaced with abstraction. What do we owe to the Harbour Railway? More than most of us know. The prosperity of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, the industrialization, the empire, the cultural confidence, the political power was built on trade, and trade was built on the ability to move goods efficiently between ship and land. The Harbour Railway was the mechanism that made that movement possible at the scale that Victorian Britain required. Every cup of tea, every piece of sugar, every bale of cotton, every plank of timber, every barrel of oil that built the Britain of the 19th and early 20th centuries passed over Harbour Railway track at some point in its journey from source to consumer. The Harbour Railway is not a romantic subject. It is not a glamorous subject. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the foundation on which the world that most of us in Britain inherited was built, and it is almost entirely forgotten. Subscribe if you believe that the things we forget are often the things that made us. And tell me in the comments, what Harbour Railway trace have you walked past without knowing what it was?
The last commercial dock railway to operate in the Port of London closed in 1970. The Tilbury docks downstream on the Thames retained rail connection for somewhat longer, and Tilbury remains one of the few British ports with direct rail access today. But the era of the intricate dock railway system, the hundreds of miles of track within the enclosed docks, the locomotive drivers who knew every siding, the fish trains racing through the night, the boat trains pulling alongside the ocean liners, that era ended in the second half of the 20th century. Quickly enough that many people who grew up in Britain's port cities can remember it, slowly enough that its passing was never marked with the ceremony it deserved. The Harbour Railway deserved a funeral. It got a planning application.